Welcome to the College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line. Here's Shehan and Bobak Hayeri.
Hey everybody, konnichiwa amigos, mesdames et messieurs, it's the College Football Survivor Show. I'm Bobak Hayeri with my favorite co-host Shehan Raja, national college football writer for CBS Sports. We are in the seeming peak of the spring hullabaloo. We're going to take a quick look at some of the major spring games that occurred last weekend, as well as looking ahead to the spring transfer portal, which opens this week on Tuesday, April 16th, the day after we record this. So there's lots of stuff to talk about. We're glad to have you with us. But before we dive in, let me remind you, you can find us on X and TikTok at CFB Survivor Show, where we have video highlights of the show, run polls, and listen to your feedback. Please take a moment to like, rate, and subscribe to us wherever you get your shows. So, first I just got to say, Shehan, good time to be a Baylor fan, man. They kept their guy.
Yeah, Dave Aranda is... Oh, wait, we're talking about Scott Drew. It's funny. We were on the podcast last week, and I was like, you know what? I'm going to have this in the background if I'm hoping that the news comes through that Scott Drew stays, and obviously it wait until after the show, but thankfully he did end up staying in Waco, and now did this story go national? The Mi Casita photo, is that something that tracks? So during this whole hullabaloo, like Kentucky people were reporting, Scott Drew is on a plane right now to Lexington, Kentucky to go look for house and be introduced. And in the middle of all of this, Scott Drew tweets a picture of him at this random Mexican restaurant in Waco, to basically be like, oh, no, I'm still here. But I don't think that he understood what was going on. I don't think he understands in some ways what Kentucky basketball is, because immediately everybody knew exactly where it was. They knew exactly what time they were there at. There was a report going around that people called the restaurant and managed to get him on the phone. I don't know if I believe that, but again, like, this is clearly something that happened at the same time, that people tried to call the restaurant so that they could try to tell him to take the job. And I think that might have been a moment when Scott Drew's like, I don't know if I'm built for this. I do not think that I am ready for this. I don't think that I understand in some ways how easy my life is at Baylor. Yeah. And ultimately ends up staying. I'm not saying by any means that is a reason that he turned down the job. I know it was a family decision. I know that he would have certainly been interested in taking the job too. But now, at that restaurant, Mi Casita, which is just south of Waco in Woodway, they actually have like a plaque there commemorating that this is the booth that Scott Drew was at in that picture.
They move fast.
They move fast. So I'm gonna be down in Waco in about a week. So I'm definitely gonna try to swing by and see the plaque for myself.
That's awesome. Oh my goodness. It's like those places where like Elvis ate here or something like that. But this is even better. This is a moment of great local athletic triumph. I love it. But so I think we'll transition now to football. Obviously some big spring days. We talked about them. We broke them down a little bit last week. It's interesting too. I was trying to think like, were they more like, the more you read about how these go, and if you watch them, because obviously there were a lot of games to see, you kind of read the recaps and you feel like, man, this is just spring ball, classic spring ball. So everyone looks great. Or, the wiser reporting would kind of point out the format a particular team is using. Some were closer to authentic football than others. Obviously, the defense is usually kind of held back a little bit. You can't go and just crush the opponent. And if you do, my goodness, are you going to have a problem? So it was interesting. Overall, just kind of generally speaking, did this spring feel about typical as any other one for you?
Yeah, I think that in some ways it was typical. In some ways, I think that it just has felt a little less like, I just feel like there's been a little less going on, a little bit less in terms of interesting stories coming out of camp. Everybody's so buttoned up these days. You know what I mean? It just feels like nobody wants to show anything. Everything's on TV, so we're going to show nothing because we don't want to give our future opponents an advantage. And it's just like, it's college football, guys. It's not that serious. I promise you. Like, it is truly not. It was fascinating. The headliner, and we talked about it last week, was Ohio State. Not just in terms of them being the most important program in some ways this offseason heading into next season, just because of how much they've invested in the 2024 season, but also they were on broadcast television. They were on Fox nationally for their spring game. I don't know if there's ever been a network broadcast national spring game in history. There's been ESPN's before, of course, but I don't know if there's ever been a Fox. I think that game drew a lot of attention because of it. A lot of attention was paid to Will Howard having a pretty good spring game, to Julian Sayin having a pretty bad spring game, Aaron Noland kind of being somewhere in between those two things. And I think the other takeaway that people really had was this secondary is going to be something. And I said last week, you want to be a little nervous when the takeaway is, wow, the defense looks really good. But I will say, Ohio State's got wide receivers. They got guys who have the ability to get open and win one-on-one matchups, and that secondary still looked really good against them. So I think that you can take that as a positive. Them whipping the Ohio State offensive line, little less you can take away from that. I think that that's maybe a little more to do with Ohio State trying to break in a few new starters in that unit. But ultimately, look, just start with Ohio State. I think that this is a program that took away what they needed from spring camp, that managed to make some waves and some headlines in the spring game. And, I look around the rest of the country. Alabama didn't necessarily try all that much, do all that much. It was notable that Caden Proctor, the Iowa transfer, was on the sidelines for that game. Not playing, but on the sidelines of that game, ready to go. So when the portal opens, which might be when you're listening to this on Tuesday, that he's going to be right there and ready to get back on campus. Georgia, not a lot to take from it. Ole Miss was like the final boss of these new spring games, in that they basically didn't even pretend to play football. They had a hot dog eating contest with Joey Chestnut at halftime instead. And you know what? Cool. If that's what you want to do, then that's what you want to do. But I think that kind of goes back to what we were saying about spring being a little juiceless this year.
Yeah, I was going to say Ole Miss stole the spring game show, in my opinion, because they just dropped all the pretension. Because we had the dry ones, the ones where nothing really, you don't find out about anybody because the offenses are being conservative. Maybe a guy's injured and they don't want to, or has been a little risky, so they don't want to put him in potential harm's way, especially like the running game and some of the linemen. So they just decided to dispense with all of that and make it fun. They basically went in the direction I would kind of love. They went even a more loosey-goosey version where I would kind of like to see, we talked about this previously, the combine ago, where it's like, how did we get to finally see the debut of Walter Nolan? We got to see him in a tug of war contest. That's exactly where we want to see him. They had, and again, apparently the sororities had their own tug of war contest. Monty Kiffin got pushed around in a golf cart. They had a slam dunk competition between the football players. They allowed 21 and over students to bring in alcohol and sit behind one of the end zones. It's like they decided to make it like a celebration of fun, which I thought was absolutely great. I don't think there's enough of that. I think it kind of goes back to why I always like, promoting Brett Yormark. It's like, this is getting what the fun in college. So, and granted, you can look at it a little bit more in the Machiavellian sense that, Kiffin's being smart. He doesn't want to show to his opponents what he has. He didn't even put out a depth chart. I know one of your colleagues at CBS Sports, John Talty, wrote a good write-up on it. And I agreed with his logic. It's like they saw what happened when Texas had their, the battle to try and grab the backup from Texas after their great spring game last year. So when you don't show a whole lot, hopefully people won't be interested. But that might be a little bit of wishful thinking. We'll see on that. But I thought the Ole Miss approach was probably my favorite. And if you're not going to do a whole lot, if you're going to play it too conservative, too quiet, then why not just go completely bonkers with this? And I love it. I hope they go even further along. I hope they get some American Gladiators. I hope you get like the joust, like get to your players with pugil sticks and helmets so they can't hopefully hurt each other too hard and just try and knock each other down off of pedestals. Just go for that. Go have fun with it. Because again, some of the others, again, I talked about Penn State. I felt bad for them because the biggest story that came out for fans was that, their star wide receiver from the previous season wasn't even there. Keandre Lambert-Smith, unsurprisingly, is almost certainly going in the portal, but no one wanted to comment on it. He just simply wasn't there. We didn't necessarily see a whole lot out of Julian Fleming either. So it was just kind of like an unsettled area. And I know wind was also a factor at that game. And then the running backs, you really just got to see backups because understandably, Kaytron Allen and Nick Singleton are great. So they didn't really run them out there, to use them. So we got to see, all right, who do you got in the backups? Okay. So we learned that there's a good backup there in Quentin Martin, but so much uncertainty there. And I mean, with the defenses, especially, you'll read like, oh, a defense looks great now. And I'm not picking on Penn State. I assume their defense is going to be great. But some of these other, programs, like the defense looked like it was more aggressive. I'm like, well, okay, but no one was tackling. Similarly, I'm just going to shift over to Utah real quick. Here, Cam Rising's looking great. He's throwing well. I mean, his arm strength's there, but they weren't allowed to touch him for obvious reasons. No one, they want to extend his use as long as humanly possible. We wish him well. But it was just fascinating to see how much of this kind of, and we've said it before, it's just guesswork and how well some of this is actually going to work in the fall.
No, it definitely is. And I'm glad that you mentioned Cameron Rising and that Utah spring game, because that was one thing that I desperately wanted to see. I wanted to see a healthy Cameron Rising. And of course, like you mentioned, not only should they not hit him in the spring, they should not hit him in the fall, and they should put him in bubble wrap during games as well, because their season in so many ways depends on his health. But it was great to see him looking comfortable. Obviously, he missed the entire 2023 season with his injury. And I think that it looks like that rehab paid off. It looks like he's ready to go. It looks like he's back to his old self. Again, look, at the same time, we're going to have to wait and see whether, like you said, under pressure, if he's able to keep doing it. But I love to see evolution as a passer. I mean, I don't want to make too much of it, but I remember back in 2011, Baylor with RG3, he had missed the 2010 or maybe it was the 2009 season. He had missed with an ACL injury, and during that time, he was already a great athlete. Everybody knew that he was a great runner. He was able to, in a different kind of way, work on his passing, work on his arm strength, continue to grow in that regard. And so when he came back in 2010, he was an improved player. When he came back in 2011, he was one of the best players in modern college football history. I'm not saying that that's what's going to happen with Cameron Rising, certainly, but I do think that it's encouraging that he looked even more developed as a passer in this spring game than he did maybe even before his injury. It's going to take some time. And again, there's going to be live defenses coming at him very soon. But to me, I think that this is one small takeaway that you can say is that Cameron Rising is healthy. And so I think that Utah is the preseason favorite in the Big 12.
Absolutely. I don't think we saw anything that would cause us to doubt it. I mean, the only real knock, and it made sense because they were trying to figure out the quarterbacks and making sure everyone got reps. We didn't really, because we talked about in the previous week, the question of who was going to be the leading rusher, who was going to step up. They didn't really get a chance to test their running game a whole lot, and their defense was still pretty good at stopping running lanes. So again, you get that classic. Well, is there anything to really? We didn't see it very much. Was there anything to worry about, or is it just the fact that Utah's defense is going to be back where it will be? Although one other note, I had actually a friend who was in Salt Lake City for the game, Dorian Singer, and by all accounts of people writing it up the game, the USC transfer originally from Arizona, looked like he was a good match and a good person to step up in there. Another one I want to mention, we talked a little bit about that backup race only because of the potential for injury that Cam Rising has shown before. It sounds like, by all accounts, Isaac Wilson seems to be stepping up as, if things were to go as they were, he would seem to be the quarterback number 2 heading into the fall. But yeah, it was fun to just kind of look around at how some of these games were going. I mean, obviously Willie Fritz, he's starting out at Houston. People were saying the defense looked a little bit more assertive, but again, what does assertive mean when you can't really tackle anybody? Probably we'll see a little more running game there. Their starting quarterback, or the previous incumbent, Donovan Smith, was held out of the spring and didn't throw in the spring game because, again, he's recovering from a shoulder injury. So again, there were so many of these games out there where it was just sort of like, it's unclear. And especially, I wonder if the spring portal, is that opportunity to really see what the coaches actually feel about their team, based on where they start to go into and where they grab.
No, I think that's absolutely true. And again, I look at a program like Penn State that just lost, their top receiver to the transfer portal. Transfer season's among us. I mean, starting on Tuesday, we're going to get the second portal wind, and we've already, in a short period, seen some surprising entrants. Keandre Lambert-Smith, a wide receiver from Penn State, like we've mentioned. Damian Martinez at Oregon State was like, to say that he was building their program around him was an understatement. He was a two-time All Pac-12 player, first team All Pac-12 running back last year, and he was supposed to be like the guy who was coming back in 2024, but he ultimately decided to leave for the portal, and I think that he's going to be one of the top sought after players in this spring transfer window. Caden Proctor, like I mentioned before, from Iowa going to Alabama, I think that already is a huge deal. But the rumors are coming out right now of camp, and our 247 sports team has been all on top of this as well, is that this could be a potentially extremely hectic post-spring portal window. Now, one thing that I'll mention, because I don't think that a lot of people realize this, SEC players are actually not allowed to transfer to other SEC schools. So if you see an SEC player enter the portal, they likely will not end up at another SEC school. Now, people might wonder, well, why is that the case? Why are they allowed to have transfer rules? They're SEC rules. They're not NCAA rules, which right now cannot be enforced. But teams, by choosing to be in the SEC, can be enforced by the SEC. And by the way, this is also one of those things where it turns out when people really want to be a part of your organization, you can actually have rules and enforce them in a different kind of way. But that's something to keep an eye on heading into this window. SEC players will not transfer to another SEC school. But ultimately, I mean, when you look ahead to this portal window, what will you be keeping an eye on?
I'll be really well. First of all, by the way, the SEC thing I found really fascinating when I started to hear about it. Only because I agree with you. I don't think it could be, because my first thought is, why doesn't somebody just challenge it? But I agree, the competition is there. You just don't have to be at an SEC school. You could be at other schools. Now, if they all start doing that, if all the conferences start doing that, that might be a problem. I'm not saying don't challenge it. I mean, there's always a reason to challenge everything, but yeah, I found that one interesting. That feels like the old days of transfers being told, like, oh no, you can't transfer to that team, when the coaches could veto specific programs. But heading over to what I'm looking forward to, I am most interested to see, like, which team is going to cause the biggest ripple effect. And I think what some folks have to remember looking into this portal season is, because of Nick Saban, we had a bunch of schools jump into have portal windows open, or at least transfer windows open, almost too late in the game to make any difference. So there are some marquee programs going to be involved in this, like Alabama and Michigan, will obviously losing Harbaugh to the NFL. So you got Alabama, Michigan, Washington, to a lesser extent Arizona. You've got programs out there that suddenly now are going to be playing to backfill what happened in that immediate window after they lost their head coach so late in the normal coaching season. So I'm interested to see which ones kick off, sort of maneuvers one after another. Because we talked about it, initially, with the fact that Ole Miss pretty much seems to want to take back their running back to replace Quinshon Judkins from Miami, which will cause Miami to look for a running back, which seems like it's going to affect potentially Oregon State, as we were just talking about it, and how that daisy chain is going to keep going along. I mean, for me, I'm now curious to see, like, will Michigan jump in and get a quarterback? And what will that cause in the chain effect of people needing to get quarterbacks? Will Auburn decide to get a quarterback? Because I'm not sure. I mean, they weren't last week, but we've had a couple of weeks to sit on it. I'm not entirely sure where Auburn's going to be. So I'm curious to see which programs that we may not even be thinking of as they're going to jump in are going to make a move that's going to cause that chain of moves that will suddenly surprise fans and generate headlines that will hopefully be reasonable, but some will probably say this is why the system is broken, et cetera, et cetera.
No, well, I think that quarterback and this quarterback cycle, I really don't know what to expect because it is incredibly difficult to come in the fall and truly compete for a starting job. It just does not happen all that often. And we've had a very active window, of course, during the post spring. But I think that ultimately, I'm going to be fascinated to see, do teams try to, like you said, bring in a starter? I look at a player like Colin Schlee, who decided to enter the transfer portal from UCLA. He was supposed to be a contender to start at UCLA last season, but was ultimately beat out by Dante Moore. Apparently will not be the quarterback this season as well under new head coach Deshaun Foster. But, does he go back to the MAC where he had some success? Kent State was a really good program under Colin Schlee. Actually, ironically, does he look at a program like San Diego State, where his former head coach, Sean Lewis, now is? I'm going to be fascinated to see. Another factor that I'm going to be keeping a real close eye on is the double transfer among quarterbacks. Do you see players
Mm.
who started at one school, who transferred during the postseason window, who didn't win the jobs or don't feel like they're going to win the jobs coming out of camp? Do they try transferring again? I think that there are going to be players who attempt to do that. Now, look, there are examples of guys who transferred and maybe understood this might not be, an immediate type thing, but one battle that I haven't necessarily seen a lot come out of as yet is the battle at Vanderbilt, where you have Diego Pavia and Nate Johnson, two really talented players, one from New Mexico State, one from Utah, enter the portal and end up there. Does one of them feel like, oh no, I thought that I'd be able to take this job with ease and maybe I'm not able to the same kind of way? And another piece that I'm going to be keeping an eye on too is obviously we haven't seen very many quarterback battles decided in the spring at this point, but there are some that are going to be decided in a de facto sense. One great example of this that we've already seen is at Wisconsin. Nick Evers, the former Oklahoma transfer, just entered the transfer portal. So it looks like Tyler Van Dyke, the Miami transfer, is going to be the quarterback heading into 2024. Ohio State, this is another room that I'm going to be fascinated by. Can Air Noland and Julian Sayin and Lincoln Kienholz and Devin Brown and Will Howard all stick around into the fall of 2024? Now, the advantage of that room is that Howard is the only one who's going to run up against eligibility concerns. Obviously, he's a senior at this point, and it looks like he's going to be the starting quarterback. But when you have two quarterbacks in Aaron Noland and Julian Sayin in the same recruiting class that are going to overlap, and if you're Lincoln Kienholz and you've just been recruited over multiple times in this cycle, do you give up? Do you decide to move on? I think another great example of this will be at USC. Jade Mayava versus Miller Moss. I don't expect either of those players to transfer because Mayava is a much younger player than Miller Moss. So I think that the timeline could work out okay. But that's a program that I'll be keeping some level of eye on. So there's so much that I think that we'll be able to take away, not just in terms of what programs lose a quarterback to the portal or even add a quarterback to the portal, but which programs have their backup decide to leave because he knows he didn't win the starting job.
Yeah, and it's interesting, for example, going back to Ohio State, the story I read today is they haven't announced a starter. Now, that is semi-believable only because, it seemed like there was a bit of a race there between Brown and the presumed starter, but I don't know. We'll see. You don't bring a guy from Kansas State, especially one that was a fight to get and potentially some serious NIL cash being thrown around, to not start them at all. But, the one that I am circling, I'm like, Reese Poffenbarger. I'm not quite sure if it's Barger or Barger, but, talented guy. They recruit him. They bring him in from Albany. Good FCS, quarterback. And then Cam Ward, by all accounts yesterday, or I should say a couple of days ago, was exactly as advertised. So if you're that guy, you're like, well, I want to be somewhere I'll be appreciated and I'll be able to be the starter and prove what I can do. So I wouldn't be shocked to see him as an example of someone who might depart. But you never know. But sometimes being patient pays off. Miller Moss is a great example of that. He's stuck around. He was obviously a highly recruited quarterback. He was Lincoln Riley's first recruit, and now he's been able to shine there. So maybe some of these guys who you'd expect to leave will stick it out. It's hard to predict. I mean, that's the nature of being young and part of the joy of this sport. Also in this spring transfer portal, who are some of the biggest names that have your attention so far? I should say so far. We're really early on and we're only getting the early ones.
Yeah, let's be clear. We're recording on April 15th at about 3 p.m. Central Time. So whatever happens after that, we have no responsibility for at this point. And trust me, we'll make sure and get into more of the transfer class when we come back for Thursday's show. But, running back Damian Martinez is a player that we mentioned, of course. And I think that he has a chance to be a potential game changer at some major programs. The one that jumps off the page at me is you look at Ole Miss and what they lost by losing Quinshon Judkins. I don't know if they'd invest that heavily in bringing in Damian Martinez, but I think that he would be a potential game changer over there, potentially one that could, I don't want to say lock up a trip to the college football playoff, but I do think that he would play a huge role in being able to add to it. Keandre Lambert-Smith coming in from Penn State, I think that that's another player who has a chance to be like one of the top players in the transfer portal this cycle. Receiver is one of the biggest positions that has been targeted by teams in the portal. Everybody kind of feels like, well, I can just get an experienced receiver in here and he'll be able to kind of come in and fix everything. We'll see whether that ends up being the case. A player who's been huge so far and super popular in the portal has been Philip Bliddy, the Indiana transfer. Started his career at Texas Tech. We've seen him take visits to Oklahoma already. We've seen him see some other big time programs and similar sort of deal. We talked about Bear Alexander last week, deciding to come back to school at USC, one of the biggest retentions of this period. Well, defensive tackle remains a top priority for a number of the best programs in the country. Alabama, Georgia, USC, Texas even could potentially get into the mix at defensive tackle. So I think that those are the positions that are going to be biggest. And what I want to talk about big picture is, when we previewed the transfer cycle, defensive tackle, quarterback, wide receiver. I think those are going to be the top priorities. Also, offensive line, I'd throw into that list as well. And the thing is, you can target anybody that you want. You can try to bring in whoever you want. These are tough positions to fill. There is going to be a high demand for some of these position groups, and the supply, when you look at the list right now, isn't that high. I do think, not that I'm alleging that college football has tampering or anything like that. I do expect that there are going to be some big-time players who we don't expect enter the portal. Maybe Keandre Lambert-Smith is one of them. Maybe he already knows his destination as a wide receiver. But I do think that ultimately, Tuesday is going to be potentially an incredibly hectic day. It's something that a lot of reporters have been teasing, especially those who cover the transfer portal. But ultimately, when I look at the list of guys that we have at our disposal right now, Damian Martinez and Philip Bliddy are at the top of the list.
Yeah, those are definitely names to keep in track of. The transfer portal, again, opens Tuesday, the 16th, which is tomorrow, the day after we record this. So there are going to be a lot more names going in the portal. Now, the question is, how big are those names actually going to be? So lots of exciting things to talk about. I have a feeling a little later this week, we're going to come back to this topic and see where some of these names might be going. Some people, as we know, are dropping into this portal knowing exactly where they're going to land. So it'll be interesting to see how many of those happen, and we can ponder why they happened so quickly, because clearly they couldn't have been in tampering before, but we'll see about that. But lots of things to keep track of. As I said at the beginning, this is the peak of the spring season because we've got spring games going on. We've got the transfer portal about to open up. Lots of excitement. Say what you will, but college football is definitely more interesting year round thanks to this stuff. And I know I enjoy it, and I hope some of you too, so long as your favorite players don't leave your team. I'm going to go ahead and start wrapping this up. I want to thank all of you for listening to us. We always appreciate having you on this journey, which sometimes for us can be a technical mess. Sometimes not. I wanted to thank our producer, whose fault is never. He's awesome. It's Joey Aliberti. I just want to give him a quick shout out. Be sure if you get a chance to like, rate, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. You can find us on X and TikTok at CFB Survivor Show. He's Shehan J. Raja. You can find his work at CBSSports.com and at Shehan J. Raja on X and TikTok. I'm Bobak Khayeri. Thanks for listening, everybody. Enjoy your week.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.